My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Old Testament prophets and kings, and scheming scoundrels too, collected in this book, Exile of the Chosen, God's Heroes from Solomon to Malachi. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended. Chapter 4, Part 2, Zillah. Zillah was excited. Her grandparents were returning to the palace for a few weeks to spend some time with the rest of the family. Though Zillah had visited her parents, she had not been inside the main palace for 2 years. As she walked into the throne room, it was the end of the day, and no one was there. She stood with her hand on one of the ornate pillars looking around and remembering how as a little girl she had stood up in the balcony behind the lattices to watch the king and her father make important decisions on how to run the nation of Israel. Suddenly she jumped and let out a little shriek. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you," a young woman's voice said. "Is that you, Zillah? It's me, Susanna, remember?" "Susanna!" Zillah exclaimed, giving her a big hug. "I haven't seen you for a couple years." She held her at arm's length. "You've grown up a lot." "So have you. Where have you been all this time?" "I went to live with my grandfather Obadiah for a while. After Princess Athaliah moved to Judah to marry King Jehoshaphat's son, I wasn't really needed here, although they have younger ladies in waiting in the Queen's Court, too." "Yeah," said Susanna, "that's where I'm serving now." "It's been nice at Grandfather Obadiah's house, but sometimes I miss my family and my friends." Susanna smiled. "Oh, you wouldn't believe this place now. If you think things were difficult when Ahab was a king, you should see how they are now." Zillah quickly glanced around. Her father had always warned her of the dangers of palace gossip. It could get a person in trouble. But Susanna chatted on merrily. "King Ahaziah must be worried about other people trying to steal his throne, because there are spies, and then spies watching the spies, and spies watching the spies who are watching the spies. And nobody knows who's listening to whom, and who's going to whom about what they said." She giggled. Zillah smiled. "Then it would be important," she said slowly, "not to say anything that you wouldn't want repeated to anyone." "Yeah, that's what my mother keeps telling me, but you can't go through life worrying all the time, otherwise you'd be just like King Ahaziah." "I'm sure he has a lot of things on his mind to be concerned about," Zillah replied cautiously. Susanna chatted on. Suddenly, they heard a sickening cracking sound behind them, and then a crash. The girls spun around. The lattice on the balcony above them had given way, and someone had tumbled to the floor. As they rushed over to see if the person was injured, they suddenly stopped, filled with horror. It was the king. Zillah dropped to her knees. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "you're hurt." "Get help right away," the king gasped. "I can't move. I can't move my arms or legs or anything." Jumping to her feet, Zillah ordered, "Stay here with the king, Susanna. I'm going to get help right away." She rushed out of the chamber. "Guards!" she called. "Father, somebody help us. The king is hurt." Soon a mob of people filled the room, and officials hurried the girls out of the way. As they stood outside, Susanna whispered, "Do you believe the king was listening to us? Do you think he heard what I said?" "I don't know. It almost looks like it." "Right before you came," Susanna continued, "there was an ambassador from Babylon who had been talking to one of the princes. Perhaps the king had been listening to them." "Perhaps. Do you think we'll get in trouble?" Zillah looked at her for a moment. "I think the king is injured very seriously, and I don't think anyone is going to care what either of us had to say. Right now they're going to be worrying about helping the king." "Oh, I hope so," Susanna said, "because if he wasn't hurt badly, he might be mad about the things I said." "Susanna, please be careful," Zillah said. "Don't say things like that. We don't really want the king to be hurt badly. After all, he's our king." The other girl swallowed hard. I should be more careful. That's what Mother always tells me." The two girls walked slowly back to Zillah's family's living quarters. Neither of them could think of anything else to say. A feeling of doom seemed to hang over them, like a dark cloud. Later that night, when Zillah was alone with her father, she was able to ask a few questions. Was the king injured as badly as it looked today? Her father studied her for a moment. I think he's hurt very seriously, Zillah. Well, he couldn't move his arms or his legs. That sounded pretty terrible to me. How can somebody be king when they can't even move? His injuries are very serious, her father repeated. We're waiting for a few days to find out whether it looks like a permanent injury, or whether he'll be able to regain some movement. He has been very concerned about others trying to steal the throne from him, and not to be able to move would make it much more possible. Poor King Ahaziah. I'll remember him in my prayers this evening. Her father sighed. I too pray for the king, although so far he has chosen not to go to the God of Israel for help. He worships the god Baal. Like his mother? Yes, like the Queen Mother. But I still pray for him every night. For even though he doesn't worship the true God, he is still my king, and I am loyal to him. I know you are. Zillah hugged Jedediah. You're a good man, father, and I think the king should be proud to have you as one of his counselors. Her father smiled back, but tension filled his eyes and his jaw was clenched. Do you think that if someone could find the prophet Elijah, he might ask the God of Israel to heal King Ahaziah? She asked. That's a possibility. He always has had great respect for the requests of his prophet. But Ahaziah hates Elijah, and I'm pretty sure he will not ask him for help. It seems like a bad time to have too much pride to ask for help, she observed. He sighed and frowned. Let's wait and see what happens. The next morning, Zillah met Susanna in the courtyard as the other girl carried 2 large baskets. Here, let me help you carry that, she said to her friend. Oh, thank you, said Susanna. There's enough here for 2 to carry. Have you heard the latest? Zillah shook her head. The king has sent a group of soldiers with gifts to the Baal in Ekron to find out whether he's going to live or die from his injuries. To the Baal in Ekron? Zillah repeated, her eyes widening. Yeah, that's the Baal he likes the best. He figured that if the Baal can tell him what's going to happen next, it'll help him make some decisions. And he's sending lots of gifts so that the Baal will be in more of a mood to help him. Zillah did not say anything. To her it seemed that asking for help from Baal was even worse than not asking for help at all. It was like a slap in the face to the God of Israel, whom she was sure was the only one who could heal the king of so serious an injury. My mother thinks the king is going to die, Susanna continued. She tells that she's seen soldiers who've been injured like that. Usually it comes from a fall from a horse or being hurt in their necks. And she says once they're paralyzed from the neck down, they never recover. Some of them die right away because they can't even breathe. Others live for just a little while, but none of them ever get better or walk again. But who knows? I suppose if you gave Baal enough presents, he might do anything. Zillah kept quiet. Is it time to keep silence and keep from getting in trouble? She wondered. Or is this a time to speak up and remind Susanna of the true God? She closed her eyes and shot a quick prayer toward heaven. O God of Israel, she whispered in her mind, please tell me when it is right to speak. The skies were as silent as the throne room in the palace, so Zillah said nothing. A huge commotion in the courtyard caught everyone's attention. Zillah rushed out with the others to see what was happening.
He was a arrogant guy,
a farmer, stammering at having to speak in front of such a large crowd, said.
And he wore a camel's hair tunic thing.
But what about the soldiers? A guard questioned him.
He raised his hand and called out fire from heaven. There was a big crack of thunder, and fire came, and all the soldiers vanished.
It is the prophet Elijah, Zillah's father interrupted. We haven't seen him for many years, but I'm certain it's him. He stopped the messenger Ahaziah sent to the Baal of Ekron. The king then sent those 50 soldiers to capture the prophet. The captain of the guard and Zillah's father headed toward Ahaziah's private chambers. The king was notorious for his temper. Whereas his father used to get grumpy and silent when he was unhappy, Ahaziah was just the opposite. The palace would echo with his shouting when he was upset. Zillah was glad she wasn't the one who had to deliver the message. Before long, a second group of soldiers left to capture Elijah. Zillah shook her head. Did the king really think that 50 of his soldiers were more powerful than the prophet of the Most High God? She felt sure it was a mistake. That evening she could hardly eat her supper as she waited to hear what would happen next. Sure enough, another horrified messenger stumbled into the court. The same thing had happened. Elijah had again rejected the king's arrogant order to return to the palace with them, and again the prophet had called down fire. All 50 soldiers had perished. Zillah put her hands to her face in horror. 100 men, 100 fathers or brothers or sons of families who loved them were now dead. What would the king do now? Was it really worth confronting the prophet of God a third time? She shook her head as she thought of all the families who would be grieving tonight because of the king's choices and his stubbornness. It was late when her father returned to his private apartments. Zillah ran to him. "Father, what's the king going to do?" "He's sending another 50 men in the morning," he said tersely. "Another 50 to Elijah? Why?" "Because that's what the king wants to do." "But they all have families and children. Some of my friends have fathers who are soldiers of the king," she protested. "Yes, the more responsibility one has, the more innocent people are affected by every decision you make. King Ahaziah has the top position in the land, so his decisions affect more people than anyone else's." But, "Zillah, say no more about this now." Recognizing the tone of voice, she lowered her eyes. That evening she tossed and turned on her pallet, but sleep eluded her. Finally she crept out and went up onto the rooftop where she and Susanna used to sit when they had been little girls. The full moon bathed the palace in a silvery light. "Oh, God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob," she whispered, "we really need your help. My king needs your help. My nation needs your help. Lots of my friends have fathers in the army. Susanna's father is in the army. If the king sends out another 50 men tomorrow, and they run into Elijah, please don't send fire down on them again. I know the king wants them to capture Elijah, but all of those families without a father." Her lips began to tremble, and her eyes filled with tears. Suddenly she realized someone was watching her. She spun around. "It's just me," Susanna said softly. I heard you. Were you talking to that God?" "Yes, I'm a follower of the God of Abraham. I just haven't told anyone because I know, because officially everybody worships Baal right now." Zillah nodded. "But if there was ever a time when our country needed the help of the God of Israel, it's now." "I'm really scared," Susanna said. "My father's in charge of the group that'll leave in the morning." Zillah's eyes widened. "I was just talking to God about that." "Maybe the God of Israel will listen to you. I can't imagine life without my father." "He's a merciful God," Zillah said, putting her arms around her friend, "but a God of justice. I don't know what he'll do." Then the tears came. Both girls cried and clung to each other. "If only the king would just ask the God of Israel for help," Susanna gasped. "Then my father would be safe." "Maybe your father should ask Elijah's help instead of arresting the prophet." "The king would kill him," Susanna protested. "Maybe," Zillah shrugged. I don't know what he should do. It's so hard to know what anybody should do these days. Life is so complicated. I just keep trusting that the God of Israel will take care of us and will have mercy on our country and on our king and on your father." "Do you think he would mind if I asked him too? I haven't ever actually talked to him before, and he probably knows that I worship Baal." "He knows," Zillah said, "but I think he would be happy to hear from you. We could talk to him together." And they did. The girls spent the next afternoon pacing back and forth on the rooftop of the part of the palace in which they lived. Suddenly Susanna let out a shriek. "They're coming! Oh, they're coming, all of them!" Zillah looked. Sure enough, a large band of soldiers were returning. She strained her eyes to see if they carried a prisoner. They did not. What could have happened? The girls raced down to the courtyard. It seemed like forever until the soldiers finally arrived. Zillah's father was there to meet them. Surprise flashed across Zillah's father's face when he saw everybody still alive, but only for an instant. "He did not call down fire on you?" he asked the captain.
No.
Susanna's father leaned toward Jedediah and whispered,
I fell on my knees and begged him for the lives of me and my men. We're only soldiers, I explained. We're only doing what we were told.
Zillah's father nodded curtly. And what did he say? Before Susanna's father could answer, a voice came from the rear of the squad of soldiers. Elijah stepped forward. "The Lord says that Ahaziah will die from his injuries," he announced. "Take me to the king." Impulsively, Susanna flung her arms around Zillah. "It's true! It's true! Oh, the God of Israel, save my father!" Zillah nodded soberly. "He is very kind and merciful, but King Ahaziah—" Soon afterward, a loud wail tore through the palace from the royal chambers and spread through the palace. Jedediah appeared in the doorway with another individual. "The king is dead," he announced. "Long live King Joram." The men fell on their knees before the person who until a few minutes before had been Prince Joram, brother of the king of Israel. Now he was the king. Susanna giggled to herself, then pulled Zillah to one side. "Isn't it going to be a bit confusing?" she whispered. "What do you mean?" Zillah asked. "Well, isn't Jehoshaphat's son named Prince Joram too? When King Jehoshaphat dies, he'll be king. Then we'll have King Joram of Israel and King Joram of Judah." Zillah smiled faintly. "And I guess we'll call them King Joram of Israel and King Joram of Judah, so we know who we're talking about." "I suppose so," the other girl said. King Joram stood surveying the kneeling men before him. Then he spoke. "We will remove the Baal from the palace," he began. "Under the circumstances, I believe that is the wisest way to start my reign over this nation." A cheer went up from the soldiers. Zillah smiled, and Susanna applauded. Perhaps now it would be easier to be a worshipper of the God of Abraham and the nation of Israel. At least, she certainly hoped so. Change was in the air. I could feel it. Many more guardians than usual pressed close, and we knew that the Almighty had plans afoot. We were all watching carefully to see what would happen. The Mighty One wasn't the only one with plans, though. Susanna chattered with excitement. "I'm going to be married. I'm so excited. Now I have a chance to have a family. And who knows, maybe one of my sons will be the Messiah." Zillah hugged her. "Wouldn't that be wonderful?" she said. "But I can't imagine you married and a mother. We're still almost children." "No, we're not," Susanna argued, stretching herself up to her full height. "We're women now, remember?" Zillah put her hand over her mouth and laughed. "Of course I remember. It's just that being a woman after being a child a few days before just doesn't feel that much different to me. I thought when I became a woman I would, well, know everything." "Yeah," Susanna said. "I don't feel very grown up either, but I'm sure not going to let anybody know." She grinned. "You don't have to either. You look wise and wonderful on the outside." Zillah laughed again. "I'm going to ask my father if you can come with me to my home as my mother and I prepare for the wedding," Susanna continued. "You've been with your grandfather Obadiah for a couple of years. I'm sure they wouldn't mind if you came to my house just for a few months to help me prepare." "Yes," Zillah said after thinking about the offer for a few moments. "In the beginning, you and I were here to be companions serving Princess Athaliah, and since she married and moved to Judah, we've had a lot more freedom. Although you stayed here and helped out in the palace." "Of course, that's where all the fun stuff goes on." "I was pretty happy with Grandfather Obadiah," Zillah said, "but I would enjoy helping you get ready for your wedding." After Zillah's parents gave their permission, she joined the group traveling to Susanna's family home. As they rounded a hill on the trail, they could see a dust cloud coming toward them.
"It must be some men on horses," Susanna's father said. "They're traveling fast. We should get to the side of the road."
They pulled their donkeys off the trail to make room for the fast-traveling band of men. But it did not continue on. "Syrians!" hissed Susanna. "It's a raiding band!"
"Run!"
Some of the men in the band fought the Syrian soldiers. Several servants hid themselves behind rocks. Zillah was terrified. Although she wanted to run, her legs wouldn't move, and she just stood there shaking. The skirmish was short. A soldier grabbed her and threw her across the horse in front of him and galloped away. It seemed like forever until they at last stopped. A larger group of Syrians waited at the entrance of a small cave with other prisoners. The soldiers were talking, but Zillah did not understand their language. It was a brief rest, just long enough to eat and stretch her cramped muscles. Then the captives and the soldiers sped towards Syria. Raiding bands did not stick around for an army to catch them. They just dash into Israel long enough to kill people and destroy lives and then escape quickly, Zillah thought bitterly. Soon she was so thirsty that she felt as if her tongue was permanently stuck to the roof of her mouth. "God of Israel," she whispered, "where are you? Did you see this? I know that if the prophet Elijah had been there, he could have called down fire from heaven and burned up these guys, but he wasn't there. But you can see everything. Why didn't you do anything to help me? I've always been loyal to you." My heart ached for her. Feeling so alone, even though surrounded with extra guardians, she was only a human. She couldn't see or feel their presence. Could she accept by faith that the Mighty One had a plan and that he was always in control? I hoped so. This broadcast has come from the book Exile of the Chosen by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.